Hi folks, and I've got a really topical subject for you today. Today I'm going to talk about the differences between metal and hard rubber or ebonite mouthpieces. So first of all I'm going to explain the differences between the two materials, and then I'm going to do a few comparisons on both alto and tenor sax. And then after all that and my conclusions as to how they're sounding and all the rest of it, I'm going to hopefully give you a few recommendations as to what you should go for in what situation. So first of all, let me bust the biggest myth on this subject, which is that metal mouthpieces are bright and hard rubber mouthpieces are dark. You hear that said a lot. That is part of the general conversation of sax players in the community when we're having conversations on the phone and all the rest of it. As the number one thing that we hear being mentioned, being discussed when it comes to the overall topic of metal versus hard rubber. Now, this may be true in some cases, but it is definitely not a general rule. The key thing that determines the majority of the mouthpiece's sound is actually the internal geometry of the mouthpiece, the shape within the mouthpiece. And beyond this, the material does play a part, but not nearly as much as the internal shape of the mouthpiece. So there you go. I've already given you the answer if you like, to this video within 1 minute of the video, but bear with me because we're going to get into it in some more detail and explore this in some depth, because there are a lot more nuances to it than just simply you have a bright sound and a dark sound. So let's make this as scientific as possible. I'm going to start with playing some alto pieces. So I have got a Theo Wanny hard rubber Durga 4 mouthpiece for you here. So before I begin to play, I should point out, and you may know this already, this is a very bright mouthpiece. It's got a lot of baffle going on. But the topic today is hard rubber versus metal. So the scientific part of this is I'm going to compare this one with a metal version, which is kind of like comparing apples with apples, because the internal geometry of this mouthpiece is pretty much identical to that of the metal version there on the floor to my left. So let's start with this one here, give it a few notes, and then compare with the metal one and discuss. Well, that was a really interesting test, because for me, I actually enjoyed my experience on the metal mouthpiece a little bit more, because I was actually getting a fuller range of overtones and harmonics in the sound. So I felt that there was more of a variety of tone on offer, a bit more flexibility there. But it's not just a case of one is dark and one is bright. I think you'll agree that the hard rubber mouthpiece I played first of all had an overall bright sound, very focused. For me, the chief difference between these two is that the hard rubber one had a little bit more of a compression to it and a bit more edge, whereas this one here had a slightly fuller body overall, but when you really push it, it had this extra kind of pack and attack in the sound. And I think you could probably get a few more decibels out of this one. When you really push it, the volume is greater. But then when you drop back to that kind of mid-level, it's an extra body in the sound there. And certainly when you drop it right down, there's quite a nice subtone. So a lot of variety on offer from this metal mouthpiece here. So a very interesting test, and it goes to show that it's not a case of black and white. You've got one that's dark and one that's bright. There are all sorts of subtle layers within the overall scope of things. So that's the alto side of things. Let's move swiftly on to tenor. And on the tenor side of things, I'm going to play an Otto Link hard rubber tone edge versus a Super Tone Master. It's not quite like comparing apples with apples because they are slightly different designs, but it could be a slightly different discussion on tenor. So let's see how that goes. These two mouthpieces on tenor could not be more contrasting than the two on alto. That's the first most obvious thing to say. I mean, it was so dark and almost muffled really when I first played that the Ebonite tenor mouthpiece back there. And then actually moving on to the metal one, the sound was fairly similar. We're still in that slightly muffled vein, but the sound does this a little bit more. I think you can probably hear there's a bit more brassiness in the sound. There's a little bit more ring to the sound, and I can hear, again, just like I was saying for the alto there, I can hear more of a series of overtones. So it gives me, as a player, much more scope for using it out and about and having that variety, that flexibility, the colours in the sound. And sort of most importantly, the ability to be able to come above the band and actually allow your sound to just travel through rather than just get lost in the wodge of sound. But on saying that, this mouthpiece is still not massively projecting. It still has that slight woolliness. It's almost like it's fat without having that kind of compressed core that pushes forward. But you can definitely hear the differences. So I think it's a good comparison so that you can hear that hard rubber versus metal and just hear how the metal starts to take on a life of its own. But really the key message here is that it's so much to do with the internal geometry of the mouthpiece, because the difference between those two alto mouthpieces and these two tenor mouthpieces could not be more stark. So that's the sort of overall conclusion. But I mean, I've just taken my personal journey with mouthpieces. Over the years, I've experimented with, just on a personal level, hard rubber pieces, and I've swung to metal and I've swung back to hard rubber again on numerous occasions. And you sort of have to ask yourself, why do you do this? And I think as sax players, a lot of us are all guilty of doing this. We get tempted by one style of sound and then move on to another, and then somehow you get drawn back to where you started again. And sometimes it can just be the general mood that you're in for a year or two or three, or the kind of playing you're doing. You might, for say a 5-year period, be playing with a funk band that just sort of requires that sound from you, where you really need to drive the sound. And for me, that was certainly the case for many years when I was actually using a Dave Guardala Crescent, and it had such a lot of punch to it, but it also had this warmth behind it. And if I was to be using, say, that mouthpiece right now for all of these production videos that I do for you, I just feel it would be the wrong kind of sound to demonstrate instruments and make the various points that I'm making. If you like, it doesn't work so well in the studio, if you call this a studio, because when the sound, those kind of mouthpieces are isolated, often what you hear is just a lot of edge and top, and it doesn't come across so well, which is why you tend to find that a lot of studio musicians may use slightly darker mouthpieces, because the sound just by itself is brilliant. You've got a full spectrum of colour in there. It just sounds wonderful by itself, and you can mix it. The chief thing is you can mix it perfectly into whatever you're doing such that it sits correctly. Whereas in a live situation, those kind of mouthpieces with more warmth can often, the lovely warmth that you're hearing can just get lost, and it can be quite disconcerting when you take those style of mouthpieces out on gigging situations. So that's just the sort of general culture of the way these things can work. And the way it differs from instrument to instrument, my advice would be, and my observations over the years, are that for alto and smaller, so soprano, the generally accepted mouthpiece to use is more of a hard rubber piece, because you're already dealing with quite a pitchy instrument on alto and soprano. And by adding that metal element, sometimes just those extra sort of harmonics you're getting, an extra attack, combined with the natural pitchiness of the instrument, can just be too much. Particularly if you're sort of playing quartet stuff, softer jazz stuff, maybe big band stuff, it can just stand out too much, perhaps in comparison to your colleagues who might be playing hard rubber pieces on second alto, for example. And you can actually get quite a punchy sound just choosing the right hard rubber piece on alto. So you get the best of both worlds. You could choose a mouthpiece that has a certain amount of baffle, which gives you that edge, but also might have a decent sized chamber to give you that warmth. And then you combine it with the fact you're on alto, and you've got plenty of travel in the sound to work in most situations. I mean, personally, I actually use a Mayer mouthpiece on alto and have done for years. And it has actually been slightly doctored just to give a little bit more here and there in certain areas. But I find that it's absolutely adequate for all kinds of playing, whether it's big band or doing kind of pop stuff where you really need to kind of come through the texture. So that works for me nicely on alto. But on tenor, it can be a different conversation, and you often have tenor players upgrading or moving to metal mouthpieces and using metal mouthpieces for every style of playing, whether it be softer jazz or pop function stuff, funk stuff, rock and roll, all that kind of thing. And the reason is the general sound of the tenor is a lot warmer and wider, gruffer, and the range is lower anyway. So you're kind of fighting against a lot of different aspects there in order for the sound to come through. And that's why with a metal mouthpiece, with those extra harmonics and sort of series of overtones on display, the combination of the metal plus those characteristics I just mentioned can really work on tenor. So it's much more of an accepted thing to move on to a metal mouthpiece or use a metal mouthpiece on tenor for that reason. And the same could be said for baritone as well. Just taking the conversation back to if you're more of a beginner sax player watching this video, let's say you've been playing a couple of months and you're keen just to upgrade and progress your sound and you think it's all about the gear. Yes, it is about the gear to a large degree. You've got to have a good sax that works, the right reason, all the rest of it. And you think, okay, mouthpiece, I've got to upgrade my mouthpiece. I see these metal ones are very expensive. Should I move to an expensive metal mouthpiece? And the answer is not necessarily so. Just because they are worth more money doesn't mean that they are the right solution for you. Metal mouthpieces are more expensive because of the material they're made from, plain and simple. But as I just explained, it might not be the right answer on alto. And quite often what you get happening on alto is people looking to move on to the brightest metal mouthpieces after they've just transitioned from their Yamaha 4C or something like this. And that move, folks, is a disastrous move. Because if you move from just a sort of standard medium chamber, low baffle mouthpiece like a Yamaha or something like that, onto a, I don't know, let's say a Dukov or something, or perhaps a Theo 1E metal piece like I just demonstrated there, your results will not be good. You will be squeaking, you won't be used to the relaxed embouchure you need in order to get the best sound out of it, and it just doesn't develop your blowing and your embouchure in the way that you need to develop it. So that is not to be recommended. I would suggest that you move on to an Ebonite mouthpiece with a higher tip opening, the likes of a Mayer that I've been mentioning before. That will work perfectly for you if you have been playing 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 months, maybe a year, maybe even 2 years. That's probably still the right mouthpiece for you. And yes, you can move on to a metal mouthpiece in alto after a certain period of time has elapsed, but it's got to be the right one. Beyond that, if you really want to achieve that Dave Sanborn kind of sound, and you have been playing for many years and you understand technique well, then move on to it, but just be aware that it will take some adjustment if you haven't played on pieces like that before, because high baffles can cause a bad sound if not controlled properly with correct technique. So that is my warning on high baffle mouthpieces, if you like. And then on tenor, it's a similar kind of idea. You know, if you're a beginner and you're looking to progress, if you're starting on a Yamaha mouthpiece and then you're looking for the next mouthpiece, it's still a good idea to move on to a tenor mouthpiece, a hard rubber or Ebonite mouthpiece, as that will still be the best way to develop your sound. But I can totally understand that if you want to allow your sound to project more, then moving on to a metal mouthpiece could be a good idea. So, for example, the Otto Link Super Tone Master that I just demonstrated, that could work as an upgrade mouthpiece for you if you're looking to project your sound a little bit more. Perhaps you've been playing a year or two, could work nicely. And then you could look even beyond that. You know, if your wallet is slightly fuller, then there are slightly more desirable mouthpieces again than the plain Otto Link Tone Master. So it's a varied picture, as you can see. Lots to say on the subject, but I just wanted to make the main point that metal mouthpieces are not outrightly massively brighter than hard rubber mouthpieces. It's basically about the internal geometry, and the reason they get that bad name, or not bad name, but the reason they get that tag is because a lot of mouthpieces out there are designed with high baffles and small chambers, so they tend to get that reputation. But there is a whole host of mouthpieces out there made in both Ebonite, hard rubber and metal, and hopefully I just demonstrated that by giving you the Alto demo and the Tenor demo, and the two of them couldn't be more contrasting. So I think that pretty much covers all the main points that I want to say on the subject. I hope that gives you some good pointers. And finally, I would just say, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss any more future content. And other than that, thank you for watching, and I shall catch you on the next one.